Hey everyone, Herco Ray here, and welcome back to the channel where we talk about a day in the life of IT. In today's video is going to be the first video of a series that's dedicated to just PowerShell. As a sysadmin, PowerShell is extremely valuable, especially if you are looking to administer Windows devices. And in recent years, PowerShell has been expanded to work with macOS and Linux. And also as a macOS endpoint system administrator, I also utilize PowerShell in a few of my automation tasks to make my life easy and to be consistent. Whatever your fears are about PowerShell, I promise you this video will help you understand what is PowerShell and how you can actually use PowerShell. All right, so what is PowerShell? So PowerShell is a cross-platform test automation and configuration management framework. Pretty much what that means is PowerShell can work on Windows, Linux, and macOS, and it allows you to configure and manipulate and do whatever you need to do on that device. It does include a command line shell and scripting language, which means you can do stuff from the command line, or you can build out complex scripts to automatically complete any task that you may need. So it is built on top of the .NET framework. Well, actually, it's built on top of .NET. So for Windows, that is the .NET framework, and for macOS and Linux, you're going to be using .NET Core. But there will be a time where .NET framework and .NET Core will pretty much have blurred lines, and you won't even know the difference. Now, it is objects-based, so if you're used to Java or any other language that handles objects, you can either use a little information or you can use a lot of information. Now, this particular video will not go into the depths of how object-based works. That will be for a future video, but if you know anything about objects, it can be extremely helpful for you. And it also has a built-in help system, and it allows you to update that help system. So you don't have to open up a browser and try to Google what you need. You can get all the help you need directly within PowerShell. But if you do like to click around and scroll or whatever, there is a way to tell PowerShell, hey, I'm having an issue with this command. I want you to give me the direct link for this particular command, so that way you don't have to be confused about what you need to do. Now, what commands can you use? Going forward, we're not going to use the word commands anymore. We're actually going to use the word commandlets. All right, this is PowerShell's terminology on how you can process different tasks. It does have a verb noun format. So some of the verbs can be add, get, new, rename, remove, and test, while nouns can be computer, service, process, AD user, or local user. Now, the nouns are always singular, and this is because you can't tell. Well, when PowerShell was first developed, the developers couldn't really tell if a user was going to just need to get information about one computer or get information about many computers. So it just stuck with a singular noun, and when the data came back in an object-oriented format, then each object was pretty much printed one at a time, but it does it so quickly that it looks like it's done all at once. So you also may have extensions to a commandlet, which is known as parameters or switches. A parameter allows you to input extra information, while a switch sets the option of the commandlet to true or false. Parameters can take on many data types. So the data types are extremely important when it comes to PowerShell. So some of the data types includes things like string, char, byte, integer, boolean, decimal, datetime, array, or you can input an entire object. If no parameters are specified, then default values are used. So why would I need a parameter? So a parameter is useful if you're trying to get maybe all the processes that start with the word Chrome. Instead of getting a bajillion processes running on your computer all at once, you can just filter out anything that has the word Chrome in it. Now, there are other ways you can filter out information, but you always want to filter to the left of your command structure. Now, old school command line interface users can use alias to function with PowerShell. So things like ls, cd, pdw, cp, mkdir, and ping carries the same function, it just uses different parameters. And one of the biggest things I love about PowerShell that command prompt does not give you is tab completion. It's very useful to make your commandlet more readable and figure out what parameters go with that particular commandlet. So one famous example that I always use when I'm discussing PowerShell is this commandlet called test something, right? I don't know what it is, but there are not a lot of test commandlets. So if I do test computer, then I get test computer secure channel. Now notice that PowerShell automatically capitalized it for me. This is because I used the tab completion feature. Again, I'm going to do this again. I'm just going to type test and comp, and if I hit tab, it automatically completes it for me. And there is a special switch that can be used called repair. Again, if I didn't know this, I can just type -RE and hit tab, and it does it for me. Now, the very first commandlet you should always use is update-help-force in the elevated prompt. The reason you need to do this in the elevated prompt is because some of the modules are system level and you may not have permissions to write to that folder to actually update the help content of that particular module. So what you want to do is, again, run it in an elevated prompt. Now, sometimes when you run it, there's not content that is available for a particular module. So you may get an error. That's okay. But I promise you everything else will get updated. Now, I did talk about something called aliases, right? So again, ls, cd, pdw, things like that. So we're going to go ahead and break away from this using Control-C. And we're going to use cd, and we have a temp folder. So we're going to cd into the temp folder here. So if you're used to working your way around a command line, you would know that cd actually stands for change directory. Well, in PowerShell, that is actually called set location. However, you know, the developers of PowerShell knew that people were not going to want to use set location every time they needed to change directories. All right. So what we're going to do here, we're going to go back one, and we're going to do set location to temp. And there we go. Now, what if you want to know what is all the aliases that comes included with PowerShell? Well, if you run the get-alias command, you will see all of that here. So if we look at cd, where is cd here? There we go. Set location. Again, clearly it's the same commandlet, but it's just using the alias. Same thing when it comes to dir. It uses something called get child item. Maybe you come from the Linux world where you use something called ls, which stands for list. Again, get child item. Or maybe you want to know what the current path you're working with. PDW, get the location. So again, you kind of can see how that verb and noun relationship plays a hand, right? So if we go back up to CD here, we're, again, easy to understand syntax. So we can see set dash location. So I'm setting the location for this particular environment. Whereas CD, if I wasn't familiar what CD stood for, you know, I may think it stands for compact disk. I don't know. Variables. Variables are your best friend, right? And I think this is one of the advantages over what you can achieve in command prompt. Now, I get that you do have variables, but they're mainly used as environmental variables, not variables in the contents like Java and Python and things like that, right? So what is a variable? A variable allows you to store data that is in memory, right? These are defined by a $ and an equal sign. So the $ indicates that this is a variable, where the equal sign actually assigns the value to that variable. So there's different types of variables. There's user created. This is the most common variable that you're going to work with. You can also set the scope of a variable, local, script, or global. All right. Now, once variables are created in PowerShell and you close that PowerShell session, the variables are cleared. Then you have automatic variables. All right, these are created by PowerShell to maintain itself and cannot be changed. So for example, maybe you want to get the process ID that PowerShell is running. It will go ahead and return that. And you cannot change it even if you try. And we're going to test this in a little bit. And then the last type of variable is preference variables. This allows you to change the preferences and the settings within PowerShell. Again, a leg up over command prompt. So for examples, progress preference allows you to modify entries in a session. All right, so let's look at variables. All right, so variables, again, one of my example that I did was my first variable. And we're going to go ahead and do this here. This is, if I can spell, this is my first variable. All right. And we can call that back by typing in the first few letters of the variable and using the tab key to autocomplete. And again, it responds back with this is my first variable. PowerShell doesn't care about what the name of the variable is. So you can do my second variable and still have the same value. What PowerShell does care about is legal characters. And if you look at the color syntax, you can kind of see where that comes into play. So if I try to put a space here, you can see that the color syntax is changing. If I try to put a pipe here, again, you can see that the color syntax is changing. If I try to put a quote here, again, color syntax is changing. Now, let's say for some weird reason, your variable just had to contain a quote or a space or a pipe or some illegal character. What you can use is you can use a curly bracket. Now, I know this has a specific terminology, but I like curly bracket. So let's say that I want to use my first variable in quotes, and I hit int, and I do this. This is a weird variable. It should work. All right. To call that, I can't start typing it out. I have to either tab and let tab completion complete, or I can, start typing it like this if I wanted to, and then let tab completion complete. So again, you can see if for some strange reason you wanted a space in your variable, you can do that. However, there's really no need to do that, being that underscores is a legal variable. And we can test that here. If, again, make sure you know how to spell, and then we can test that here. It is a legal variable. All right. So let's talk about the automated variable. So I have PID. So this is the process identifier for this particular PowerShell session. So if I try to change it to, like, I don't know, 1, 2, 3, we can see that I cannot overwrite the variable because it is a read only a constant variable. All right. It's an automated variable that was created from PowerShell once this session was established. If we look at progress preference, right now we have continue. We also have something called silently. I guess we got to put it in quotes. We also have something called silently continue. So I'm going to go ahead and do this here. And again, that is a preference there. I believe if I do this, oh, I don't get an error there. That's strange. Oh, okay, I do get an error because it's not part of what PowerShell knows. All right. So those are the different types of variables when it comes to PowerShell. Now let's go ahead and continue into variables. So the reason why I love variables is because I don't have to declare or initialize the variable. So back in the day, especially in VB scripts, you will have to declare a variable before you can assign a value to it. All right. Now, what many PowerShell, I guess you can say, enthusiasts would tell you is you should always cast your variable. So you should say that this is a string or this is an integer, which is good, but sometimes isn't always needed because PowerShell is intelligent enough to be able to determine the data type. Now, this is known as implicit casting, but again, you can override it by explicitly casting the data type. So let's look at these data types. We have string, we have integer, and we have byte. All right. And we're going to go ahead and bring up our PowerShell window again. We're going to go ahead and clear the screen. And we're going to do this here called myString. And we're going to put in some random numbers. And if we look at myString, it comes back with the value, which makes sense. But how do we know that this is a string? Well, there's a property of this variable called getType. So if we run this here, again, I'm using tab completion because tab completion is your friend. We can tell that this is a string. Let's go ahead and remove that variable using the remove variable commandlet. And we're going to do myString. And let's get rid of this casting here. So now, if we do getType, we see that it has to convert into an integer. This is because PowerShell looked at the value that you assigned to the variable and determined that you need to be using integers, right? So you can kind of see how PowerShell can be extremely helpful. Now, if I were to put this into quotes here and we ran this, it went back to a string. This is because PowerShell understood that you put something into quotes, and typically anything quotes is considered just a string. Now, what if you wanted to strongly cast this as an integer? Again, you can do that. And if we run it again, right, and we run myString, if I can spell, and getType, we can see that it is now an integer. Now, one of the tricky things about PowerShell, or one of the gifts and the curse when it comes to PowerShell, is the ability to run particular arithmetic, right? So I can do 2 plus 2, and it gives me 4. 3 times 4 gives me 12. But what if I say 5 equals 5, and then 6 equals 6. And then I'll say 7, and we'll cast it as a string, equals 7. So if I do 5 plus 6, I will get 56. This is because 5 is considered a string because I put it in quotes, and we can look at this and see here. And actually, I'm going to go back. I'm going to make 7 I'm going to cast it as an integer here. So now if we do 6 plus 7, we get 13 because these are two integers. But if we combine all of these, we get 5, 6, 7 because 5 is a string. So instead of doing arithmetic, PowerShell is going to concatenate everything. Hey, Feature Herc here. I want to talk about concatenation. I noticed as I was editing and I really didn't go into detail. And just a quick overview, concatenation is pretty much taking one particular value and combining it with another particular value. So if one of my values is ABC and the second value of something else is DEF, I can concatenate those by using the plus sign in most languages, and I will get ABC, D, E, F. So I just wanted to, again, go over a quick overview of what concatenation was because I didn't really explain it in this video. All right, back to the video. So you want to be mindful on how you're going to use your variables and how you're going to cast everything. Because if you try to do some arithmetic, it may not go as well as you plan. And again, this is why it is a gift and a curse, because you just got to be careful about what data you're going to put into variables. Now let's talk about scopes. All right. If you look at my diagram here, this is a nifty diagram that I like to use as an example when I'm talking about scopes. So in the previous slide, we talked about local, script, and global. A local scope is pretty much like this PowerShell session that we have here. Everything that I do here is going to be local to this session. There's also something called functions, which we're going to demonstrate in a second. I'm not going to go into too much detail. That would be for another video, but a function can also be considered a local scope. Then you have script. A script is exactly what it says. It's a file that is a text-based document that PowerShell can understand, and you run that script. So think of scripts like .jars or .py or .bats, .shells. It's just a plain text file that allows you to run a whole bunch of PowerShell command and functions and everything else to accomplish whatever task you're trying to do. So the reason why we have these boxes here is because if I do something in this script, it can be referenced within this local scope here. But if I do something in the local scope, it cannot be referenced in the script. Same thing when we go to global. So global is, again, this PowerShell session here, and I can create a function, I can call a script, and I can do everything else. So let's say here, we're going to do function, we'll call it testing. We're going to say something like, I don't know, 1 equals the lonely shoe. I don't know. All right, so I'm going to call that. And actually, what I'm going to do here, we're going to say 1 is the lonely shoe. And we're going to say write host 1, or we're going to put everything in quotes here, 1. And then we're gonna, I don't know, 5. All right, there we go. So the reason, so if we look at this here, we created 5 up here in the global scope of things, whereas this 1 was created in the function. So if I call the function, which is just called testing, which probably is a bad name, what the function did was it created a variable called 1, and then it used the write host commandlet, which you can think as echo, and it said 1, which is the lonely shoe, and then we had this dash and then dash and then the variable 5, which we called up here, because 5 is at the global scope outside of the function, whereas 1 is inside of the function. So if I try to call 1, I can't do that. Even if I get my variables, there is no variable called 1. If we look here, there's no variable called 1, but there is a variable called 5 because the 5 was created outside of the function. So scopes are typically handled very well by PowerShell. However, if you want to do it, if you want to have functions and variables work inside or outside of stuff, you can actually cast a function. So whenever you want to do a function or have a variable within a function but you want to be able to use that variable outside of the function, you can do something like this here. Actually, we'll go back and we'll do this here. So you put the word global colon and then the name of the variable. So now if I run testing, now I can call that variable outside of the function. So hopefully that made sense. And I didn't even look at my PowerShell. I didn't even look at my PowerPoint slide here, but we can just look over here. So local only works in the environment where a variable was created, so a function, script, process, etc. And it is a default scope, all right, which we said. A script will only work within the script, while global will work in a PowerShell session, regardless if it is a function, script, etc. So that's pretty much what we discussed going forward. So if you want to be explicit, you want to cast that particular scope. So you can kind of think of it as a private and a public class if you're familiar with Java or anything like that. So where can you use these commandlets? There's three places where you can use commandlets: the console, which we've been doing, a text editor or IDE, and scripts. Commandlets can be used directly in the console to make changes to a computer or manipulate or retrieve data. So this is useful for quick commandlets. So something like, hey, is this person running uTorrent? Let's go ahead and run git test process -name uTorrent and asterisks, right? And you can also use an IDE. So an IDE is an integrated developer environment. And this can help you with proper syntax. And depending on the IDE, can also help with formatting. So I know there's special languages out there where formatting is a must. PowerShell doesn't really care about formatting as an indentation, where you put your opening and closing brackets. Doesn't care about that. Obviously, there is a specific format that you need to use, but if you want to make it more readable, the indentation will be your best friend. And I highly recommend you use something like VS Code, which is Visual Studio Code, which gets updated all the time, and it's completely awesome, and definitely should be using it if you're new to PowerShell. Now, scripts can be ran from a PS1 file, and you can call the PS1 file from a program, schedule a test, Microsoft Import Configuration Manager, other scripts, or even the console itself. So you can actually, if you have a script that you need to quickly run on the system, you can open up the console and just run that particular script. So which IDE should you be using? Speaking of IDEs, again, I recommend you use VS Code, but just like a car, everyone has their preference. So you have Notepad++, you have PowerShell ISE, which is probably one of the first PowerShell IDEs out there from back in the late 2000s. You have VS Code, which again is great, and you have Vim. If you're weird, you can use Vim. I don't judge you. I'm just saying you're weird. Microsoft prefers you to use VS Code as it's constantly being updated, and it is open source. So you can actually go to the GitHub page, get the open source code. You can do pull requests. You can, if you're having an error, you can see exactly what other people are having. If you want steady improvements and tight integration with PowerShell, VS Code is the way to go. Other than that, as long as you save your work as a PS1 file, again, this is the file format that PowerShell recognizes, and is properly coded, meaning that your variable starts with a $sign, you have your opening and closing brackets and things like that, the script will work just fine. Now, as of right now, there are two versions of PowerShell. There's Windows PowerShell 5.1 and PowerShell 7. Obviously, 5.1 is only installed on Windows machines and is standard for Windows 10 and 11, whereas PowerShell 7 is a cross-platform and can be installed on Windows, Mac OS, and Linux. 5.1 is still available for legacy scripts, but it is possible Microsoft may phase it out soon. There are some commandlets, such as WMI commandlets, that only work in 5.1, whereas parallels and the for each object command link only work in Windows 7. Just as a quick tip, WMI stands for Windows Measurement Instrumentation, which obviously is for Windows only, but in PowerShell 7, you can use something called CIM, C-I-M, which allows you to pretty much get the same information from the system. If you're just starting out with PowerShell, go ahead and install PowerShell 7, especially if you primarily use a non-Windows device such as macOS or Linux. That said, that's all I have. Again, PowerShell is one of those amazing things that you can use as a system administrator. Again, doesn't matter if you're a Mac admin or a Windows admin or even a Linux admin. And I got it. If you're, you run your bash scripts, you run your Z shell scripts, I get you. But PowerShell is exactly what it says. It is powerful, especially with the objects that you can use, which we will talk about future videos. Of course, we only scratch the surface of what PowerShell can do, but hopefully this gives you a great idea and a start of why it's such a valuable tool for system administration, especially for Windows. So if you're interested in learning more about PowerShell, be sure to subscribe to the channel because I got more videos coming out with tutorials and tips. I also have some earlier videos demonstrating how I've used PowerShell in a real world environment, including updating the Dell BIOS and configuring the Dell BIOS. That's all I got. If you like this video, give me a thumbs up. If you didn't like it, go ahead and give me a thumbs down. But again, subscribe to the channel. Leave a comment. What is your skill set when it comes to dealing with PowerShell? That's all I got. You guys have been awesome, and I'll see you in the next video.